What if I told you that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, a global conflict that claimed millions of lives, was also the scene of one of the largest and quietest mating markets in history? A brutally efficient market whose rules were not written by generals or politicians, but by the silent and desperate choices of women. In the next few pages, you'll discover how personal letters and declassified documents from World War II reveal a biological force so powerful and relentless that it rewrites everything you believed about love, fidelity, and female desire. The romanticized image of the faithful bride who waited for her soldier at home hides a much darker reality. In the midst of the chaos, many women saw in social collapse the chance to rise, to unite with men who symbolized status, protection, and future. War did not create hypergamy. It only tore it from its moorings and turned it into an overwhelming wave. Get ready. What you will hear is not just history, but an unsettling mirror on the present, the myth of faithful waiting and the hidden reality. When we think of World War II, the first image that comes to mind is that of soldiers in combat. Men in icy trenches, planes cutting through the skies, and cities in ruins. But there is another scene that has been engraved in the collective imagination: the woman waiting at home. This figure, almost mythical, is shown as the loyal companion who wrote letters full of love, held photos against her chest, and promised eternal fidelity until the return of her beloved. This idea was repeated in films, newspapers, and official advertisements. A narrative was created that, while the men shed blood on the battlefield, the women waited in silence, keeping the flame of hope burning. But was this really the reality? The declassified documents, letters, and reports of the time tell a very different story. In the midst of chaos, life did not stop. For many women, the war was not only suffering, it was also the greatest opportunity of their lives. They found themselves facing a scenario in which the love choice was not guided by romance, but by survival and ascension. The myth of faithful waiting was necessary to sustain the morale of the soldiers. Imagine young people struggling in distant places, surrounded by death. They had to believe that they had someone waiting for them so that they would not lose hope. But the civilian world was constantly changing. Factories required female labor. Available men became scarce, and suddenly, new uniform faces appeared: foreign soldiers, men seen as powerful, able to offer something that the boys in the neighborhood could not. The hidden reality shows that many women did not wait. Some saw the arrival of foreign soldiers as a chance for immediate security. Others understood that the future was linked to who had more status at that moment. And the war, in a brutal way, completely changed who represented this power. The myth of loyalty served as a collective consolation. But behind the scenes, human instinct, especially hypergamy, showed its strongest face. The war accelerated social processes that in times of peace happened slowly. That which was hidden or repressed appeared in a naked and raw form. And so, when we confront the sweet narrative of faithful waiting with the real documents, we discover that the home was not only a space of patience and longing, but a true silent field where female survival strategies took place. This revelation paves the way for us to understand what really happened behind the scenes of the war. To do this, we need to look at the records left, the hidden letters, and what the government preferred to keep silent for decades. Documents and letters no one wanted to reveal. The official World War II archives don't just hold military reports, battle strategies, or casualty statistics. Among forgotten reports and yellowed papers, there are letters, memos, and testimonies that expose a side of the war rarely shown: the radical transformation of relations between men and women. In confidential reports, officials already noted the curious behavior of civilian populations in occupied regions. Documents mention how local women sought contact with foreign soldiers, not just out of curiosity, but because they saw it as a chance for survival in the midst of chaos. For some, it was a way to get food, protection, a safe roof. For others, it was the opportunity to connect with someone who represented status and victory. The personal letters reinforce this reality. Many were seized and archived precisely because they contradicted official propaganda. In them, we see women reporting sudden passions, life-changing desires, and even decisions to abandon entire families to follow men who, until recently, were considered enemies. These records were dangerous to public morals. The government needed to sustain the idea of women as the guardian of fidelity, to keep soldiers motivated. Revealing the truth could generate despair, demoralization, and even defections. For this reason, for decades, the official narrative prevailed, while the most uncomfortable papers were kept silent. When we look at these documents today, we notice a pattern. They show that the war has created a market of choices never seen before. Ordinary men, who previously would not have had much prominence, suddenly gained prestige by the simple fact of being in the uniforms of victorious armies. Women, in turn, responded to this new scenario with quick and often definitive choices. These letters and reports are fundamental for us to understand hypergamy in its purest form, not as an abstract idea, but as something recorded in practice, in real decisions. They reveal that in times of crisis, humanity's oldest instincts come back to the fore, even if they contradict the romantic ideals we like to believe in. And it is from this documentary base that we can dive even deeper to understand how hypergamy, freed from social shackles, became an overwhelming force during the war. Hypergamy without strings attached, when chaos rewrites the rules. War is a social earthquake. It breaks institutions, erases traditions, and dismantles everything that seemed solid. In the midst of this scenario, hypergamy, that natural instinct to seek out the strongest, most capable, and highest status partner, has found fertile ground to manifest itself without limits. In normal times, female choice was surrounded by barriers, family rules, community expectations, moral judgments, and even religious restrictions. These barriers functioned as fences that kept hypergamy in check. But when the world collapsed between bombs and invasions, those fences were torn down in one fell swoop. Suddenly, entire cities were living under occupation. Young people who had previously worked in bakeries, markets, or factories now wore the uniforms of armies that represented power. And this uniform was more than fabric. It was an instant status symbol. It meant access to resources, physical security, prestige, and even the future. The documents show that many women responded to this new scenario without hesitation. Some approached foreign soldiers, seeking immediate protection from the violence of war. Others saw it as a way to rise. Being on the side of those who won meant guaranteeing better chances for themselves and for the children who could come. Chaos didn't just unleash hypergamy. He turned it into something accelerated, almost automatic. What in times of peace would happen slowly, with years of coexistence, courtship, and marriage, began to occur in a matter of days or even hours. The urgency of survival reduced the process to an instinct, to choose the man who seemed to have the most power at the moment. This phenomenon was so visible that even the armies themselves began to observe closely. Reports mention that foreign soldiers were quickly courted in regions where hunger and insecurity prevailed. The authorities were worried, not because they saw romance there, but because they understood that this feminine behavior could create social tensions, resentments, and even rebellions. The most impressive thing is that this dynamic cannot be read only as opportunism. It is, above all, the expression of a deep instinct, the search for security and a future through the choice of partner. The war did not create hypergamy, but it was as if it had removed all the ties that kept it discreet. This realization leads us to an even more provocative question. How far were women willing to go to ensure this security? The answer leads us to a delicate terrain, where yesterday's enemy could, in a matter of days, become the desired protector. From enemy to protector, the unthinkable choice. War is full of paradoxes, but perhaps none is as disturbing as this one. The enemy who invaded your city, destroyed houses and led acquaintances to death, suddenly became the man of choice for many women. At first glance, this seems impossible to accept. How could anyone approach the one who represented pain and destruction? But when we look deeper, we understand the invisible logic that guided these choices. The uniformed enemy was not just an invader. He was, at that time, the most powerful figure in the territory. He controlled access to food, medicine, and even freedom of movement. Being by his side meant escaping misery, protecting oneself from abuse, and in many cases, ensuring the family's survival. Reports from the time describe this behavior in several occupied regions. Foreign soldiers were seen surrounded by local women who were looking for some kind of bond. For the men who were absent, fighting far from home, this reality was an unthinkable shock. But for women who lived daily at risk of hunger and violence, it was a practical decision, shaped by urgency. It was not about romanticism, but about strategy. The powerful enemy, transformed into a protector, offered what no other man could offer at that moment: immediate security. This gesture, while reprehensible in the eyes of many, was a natural response to the survival instinct and hypergamous impulse. This phenomenon was so striking that it left deep marks on the collective memory. In some countries, women who had relationships with enemy soldiers were later publicly humiliated, accused of treason. But when we look closely, we see that behind these stories there was a clear logic: the choice of the strongest, the man who represented status and protection, even if he was considered the oppressor. This point helps us understand that hypergamy knows no political or ideological boundaries. It does not obey national narratives. Basically, it responds to a basic instinct: to seek the man who, at that moment, has the greatest power to guarantee survival and future. And if war was able to turn enemies into husbands, what does that tell us about the strength of that instinct? The answer prepares us to look more clearly at the true market that was formed in the midst of chaos. A silent but overwhelming market, where every female choice was a reflection of the struggle for survival. War market, opportunity in the midst of the end of the world. At the end of the previous subtitle, we saw how even the enemy could turn into a protector. This paradox opens the door for us to see war from an even more disturbing perspective, that of a true market. Not a market of currencies, but a market of human choices, in which status, survival, and desire circulated as if they were invisible commodities. The war created an environment where millions of men and women were torn from their usual roles. Suddenly, young men who were once just farmers or students now became soldiers, and with the uniform came prestige and authority. At the same time, women who were previously only seen as housewives were now working in factories, in hospitals, occupying functions they had never held. This transformation directly affected social dynamics. In this scenario, love relationships have become a kind of fast-paced market. Imagine entire cities destroyed, local men dead or missing, and suddenly thousands of foreign soldiers occupying streets, bars, makeshift houses. Each of these soldiers carried with them not only weapons, but access to scarce resources: food, cigarettes, clothing, medicine. And along with these resources came what was perhaps even more valuable: the perception of power and victory. Women responded to this environment pragmatically. For some, approaching a soldier was synonymous with immediate security. For others, it was the chance for advancement, to rise out of poverty and to come into contact with someone who could offer a better life. There were also those who simply sought to escape loneliness or fear, finding in these men a kind of emotional anchor. The documents reveal that this movement was so intense that in some places it came to be seen as normality. Military officials even created manuals guiding how soldiers should handle the relationships that emerged. The silent market of war could no longer be ignored. This phenomenon also exposes how hypergamy works in its rawest form. It's not just about luxury or glamour, it's about survival. In times of peace, it can manifest itself as the search for social status, comfort, or recognition. In times of war, it manifests itself directly, to choose the man who offers protection against hunger, violence, and death. This market had no clear rules, but everyone knew how to play. Women sought out the soldiers who seemed more stable, those who showed leadership or had a higher position. The soldiers, in turn, saw in these relationships an escape from the brutality of the battlefield, a psychological relief, and even a way to feel victorious in another aspect of life. But this market was not just immediate. It also had long-term consequences. Many women decided to marry these soldiers and move to another country, becoming the famous war brides. What for some began as a survival strategy ended up as a definitive transformation in their lives. As we look at this scenario, we realize that war has not only destroyed cities, but also rebuilt human dynamics. She showed that in the midst of chaos, the instinct to seek the strongest partner intensifies to the point of becoming the rule. And this rule, shaped in the invisible marketplace of war, brings us to the next point, the triad that guided these female choices. Three simple but powerful factors that explain why so many women have made decisions that, from the outside, seemed unthinkable. Security, status, and desire. The feminine triad. After understanding the invisible market created by the war, it is clear that women's choices were not random. They followed a pattern, a common thread that was repeated in different contexts and countries. This pattern can be summarized in three fundamental pillars: security, status, and desire. The first pillar is security. In times of war, daily life was marked by uncertainty. Bombings, starvation, disease, and violence were constant threats. Being next to someone who represented military power meant protection. Many soldiers had access to shelters, survival resources, and even privileges within the occupied areas. For a woman living in chaos, this was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The choice to approach these men was, above all, a practical response to the urgency of survival. The second pillar is status. Uniforms were not just clothes. They were visible symbols of victory, strength, and ascension. While local men were absent or defeated, soldiers occupying cities were seen as winners. And female hypergamy always goes to the one who represents the highest position in the group. To be with a winning soldier was, in many cases, to be on the right side of history, even if that right was painful to accept. The third pillar is desire. This is perhaps the most delicate because it involves something beyond survival and social logic. In the midst of constant fear, desire emerged as an escape, a search for pleasure and humanity in the midst of destruction. Many women reported in letters that these encounters brought a sense of life, a flame in the midst of darkness. The desire in this context was not only physical, but psychological, a way of feeling that there was still something worth living for. These three factors, security, status, and desire, combined in different ways for each woman. But the pattern was repeated. It was not the idealized romanticism of the advertisements that guided the choices, but this concrete triad. By understanding this logic, we see that hypergamy is not just about luxury or social ascension in times of peace. It's about instinct, about the way the female mind responds when all social filters disappear. And this triad, which shaped the behavior of thousands of women in World War II, is still present today in different ways, in our own relationships. But before arriving at the current reflection, it is necessary to look at a central symbol of the time, the war brides, women who became the visible face of this phenomenon, even when the truth behind them was much more complex. The war brides, between memory and truth. After understanding how security, status, and desire have shaped women's choices, we come to the most well-known symbol of this phenomenon, the so-called war brides. They became almost mythical characters in the post-war period, celebrated in newspapers, films, and official stories as examples of love that conquered distance, war, and destruction. But as we delve into the documents, we realize that the truth is much more complex. War brides were women who married foreign soldiers and often left everything behind: family, country, language, and culture. For the romantic look, they followed the heart. To the cold look of history, many followed the logic of survival and hypergamy. Alongside a foreign soldier, they had the chance to rebuild their lives in a place with more resources, more stability, and more future. Records show that thousands of women have traveled to countries such as the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. For them, this marriage was not only an effective union, but also a passport to a new reality. Instead of facing ruin, rationing, and poverty in their devastated countries, they could start over in societies that, even though shaken by war, still offered better conditions. This movement was so great that governments had to create special programs to transport these women, issue documents, and integrate these new families. Entire ships were destined to carry war brides to their new destinations. This phenomenon was not isolated. It was massive. But behind the happy stories, there were also hidden pains. Many of these women faced rejection from their communities before leaving. In occupied countries, they were seen as traitors for having had a relationship with the enemy. Some have been publicly humiliated, had their hair shaved, or been persecuted. Others carried the weight of never seeing their own family again, of cutting ties forever. This mixture of glory and shame shows how war brides represent a profound portrait of hypergamy in extreme times. They chose what seemed safest, most stable, and most promising, even if it meant facing social condemnation. Collective memory over time has softened these choices. The official narrative preferred to highlight only the romantic affairs, the marriages that worked, the families that prospered. But the documents remind us that behind every love story celebrated, there were dozens of others filled with silence, pain, and unthinkable choices. War brides were, in some ways, the most visible face of this silent market created by chaos. They showed the world that hypergamy, when freed from social shackles, can transform the lives of thousands of women and even change the fate of entire families. And it is precisely by looking at this visible face that we can trace the last connection, the reflection of this phenomenon in the present. Because even though the war ended more than 70 years ago, the instincts that drove these choices are still alive today, just adapted to a new scenario. The reflection of yesterday in the mirror of today's relationships. At this point, the inevitable question is, what does this phenomenon of the Second World War have to teach us about current relationships? Is all that stuck in the past, or do we still see the echoes of these choices in the way men and women relate to each other today? The answer is clear. The instincts that shaped war brides are still present. They just express themselves in different contexts. The war was an extreme catalyst, which showed hypergamy in its most naked form. But even in peacetime, the triad of female choice, security, status, and desire continues to guide decisions. Today, we don't see foreign soldiers occupying cities, but we do see other symbols of power: successful careers, wealth, fame, influence. If before the uniform was the passport to status, now there are other social signs that fulfill this function. The logic, however, is the same. Women tend to seek the man who represents the greatest potential for stability, ascension, and protection, whether in the economic, social, or emotional field. Social networks and globalization have only amplified this invisible market. If in the war, the choice was restricted to the soldiers present, today the showcase is global. This reinforces the perception that hypergamy has never gone away. It just transformed. When we look at the war brides, we see a disturbing mirror. Those women, in the midst of chaos, made quick, often unthinkable decisions to ensure a better future. Today, although the scenario is different, the logic is still alive. The search for the best possible partner within the available options. This reflection can be uncomfortable because it challenges the romantic ideal that society likes to tell. But to ignore this reality is to turn a blind eye to a human instinct that crosses generations. What the documents of the Second World War show us is not just a forgotten chapter of history. They remind us that behind narratives of love and fidelity are biological and social forces far more powerful than we realize. In the end, the phenomenon of war brides does not only talk about the past. It talks about us, about how human nature reacts when the world falls apart, about how the search for security, status, and desire continues to shape relationships, and about how, no matter how much society changes, the deepest instincts remain, silent but always ready to emerge when circumstances release them. This is the true legacy of war brides, not just stories of love in the midst of chaos, but a reminder that female hypergamy is a force that crosses time, rewriting the way we understand the very idea of relationship. The story of the war brides is not just a forgotten chapter in dusty archives. It is a mirror of the human being when the masks of society fall. In times of peace, we believe that love is made up of free choices, promises, and romantic ideals. But the war has shown another truth. When everything falls apart, when survival is at stake, the deepest instincts take over. What the documents reveal is uncomfortable because it forces us to see that female hypergamy was neither born nor died in World War II. She is still alive, shaping relationships to this day, just adapted to a new scenario. Perhaps the great lesson is not in judging those women, but in understanding what their choices tell us about ourselves. Because in the end, the question is not just what they have done in the past, but what would each of us do if we were on the same edge, in the face of the same chaos?